I'm going to move to our PowerPoint presentation, which we started last time but didn't completely get through. In our first session, we looked at the concept of normalcy. Who is a normal person? Who gets to decide who a normal person is? What are the institutions and practices in place that make sure people are normal? And then what does that do to people who are considered abnormal or other? We looked at different models of disability, from the charity model to the social model, medical model, relational model, the neo-colonial approach. So quite a few different ways of looking at and understanding disability. We looked at the whole concept of ableism, uh, the idea that a life uh, with a disability, or the life of a person with a disability, is of lesser value. The view that disability is something wrong or deficient or lacking, which needs to be either fixed or exterminated. So we also looked at how that ableism plays out in the lives of people who are, let's say, black or indigenous or LGBTIQ, other bodies that are seen as less than important because they're not normal or other. I hope you all had an opportunity to go through the PowerPoint presentation and work through the questions. I know that some of you had posted responses, and I was really happy to go through them. And hopefully at the end of the session today, we can come back to those. Today, we're going to move to, if you are actually following the PowerPoint as well, or even the Word document, we are at slide 41 on gender and sexuality. I hope everyone's on the same page at the moment.
Niluka, sorry to
Yes.
interrupt you. Is it
Yeah.
possible for you to put it on full screen, the
Full screen. Yes,
PowerPoint?
yes. Okay,
Thank you
okay,
so
right.
much.
No problem. Sometimes. Yeah, better, I think. Yes,
Yes,
thanks for that.
perfect.
Great. So even when we looked at disability, right, we looked at the two concepts of biological determinism and social constructivism. Biological determinism being, biology is destiny. Let's say, for example, I was born without a left forearm, and that kind of defines who you are. Whether you're able or not is determined by, your biological functions. And it's very interesting, when I went through the discussion threads, quite a few of you had said normal is equals functional. So people who are able to fulfill their normative roles, and those are gendered roles as well, which we look at today, roles of mother, father, sister, brother, in a given society, and whether your body is fit enough to do that. So if you are looking primarily as the body, or your kind of biological constituency as what determines your life, then you're pretty much coming from a biological determinism perspective. Um, when we look at a biological determinism in the context of gender and sexuality, that translates into a very kind of binary way of understanding gender. So the idea that we just have men and women, and men have their male body parts and women have their women body parts, and that means men, desire women and women desire men, and that is the natural order of things, right? There are a lot of people whose ideas of gender and sexuality are very biologically deterministic. But then I think the promise of scholarship, activism, collectivism in the area of gender and sexuality has been that we have started to question this almost kind of self-fulfilling conception of gender and sexuality by bringing in the social constructivism angle, right? So those of you familiar with Judith Butler's work, how we are socialized into our roles as males and females. If you're a girl, you get a doll. If you're a boy, you get a toy car. You're told to behave in a certain way. Boys can be rowdy, boys will be boys. Little girls need to be nice. All these little things that we're told throughout the course of our lives, basically from the day we are born, right? What are the two, again, like the two questions people ask when a child is born in most contexts? Is it a boy or a girl? Is it healthy? Basically, right? Showing how important the two concepts of gender, sexuality, and disability are when we look at what defines our life courses and identities. The social constructivism approach to gender and sexuality is looking at how gender and sexuality are quite fluid, and how desire is not just between a man and a woman, and that it can be far more fluid and polymorphous, right? So
Sorry,
uh,
sorry, Niluka.
yes,
There's a request
no
from
problem.
Dr. Mary Sport to just increase your audio a little bit. Is it?
Ah,
Yeah, just a little bit, so that the jaws will sound a little better. It's a little soft.
sure. How
Yeah,
about now?
yeah, I think it's slightly louder. So
Right. Okay. Thank you for that.
thanks so much.
Um, no problem. I really appreciate you guys pitching in here. So again, if you think of sexuality as something natural, you think in terms of testosterone and estrogen and pheromones, and people just desiring each other on a very heterosexual basis. Um, and if you look again at the disability models we spoke about, remember the charity model and medical model, which had a very individualistic understanding of disability based on what our bodies are about. But then we also looked at the social model, right, which is similar to the social constructivism approach to gender and sexuality, because it looked at how social barriers, practices, attitudes, ideologies, that is what determines disability, right? But I think, today I got a really good wake up call to kind of not go into that binary, because remember, when we were looking at the disability models, I highlighted how, especially feminist disability scholars had said, we can't take the body out of the equation, right? Either when it comes to gender sexuality or when it comes to disability. So, for example, like today, I'm having a bit of a, kind of tough day because of my repetitive strain injuries which I get because of my disability, and it's impairment related, and the experience of that impairment, right, whether it be pain or discomfort or reduced functionality, is actually quite real. So similarly, if we look at our sexed bodies, there are some realities that are there by virtue of the bodies that we have. So what I'm trying to say here is, while having this biologically deterministic view is quite transformed. Sorry, I mean, while having the social constructivism approach to disability and gender can be very transformative, we cannot afford to neglect the body and leave it out of our narratives of how we understand both disability and gender. Um, so when I was making these PowerPoints, I just Googled Barbie and Ken, because they seem to be like the epitomes of sorry, let me go back, epitomes of heterosexual beauty. At least when I was a kid, Barbie dolls were like a big deal. I was never into them, but I'm sure a lot of you grew up with Barbie and Kens in their lives, or at least hearing about them. They really do represent a very kind of heteronormative idea of gender and sexuality. Interestingly, in this picture, let me just, here we go. Interestingly, in this picture, right? So Ken is in a chef's outfit, and Barbie is wearing an apron. Both of them can be located in the kitchen in this. But what's interesting is that Ken is playing a professional role, right? A chef's role, whereas Barbie is playing a domestic role. I remember when I was a kid, my mom used to be like, oh, how come all the greatest chefs and musicians in the world are men? I said, well, the men are the ones who usually get paid to do those things. And when a woman does that, when the woman cooks, the woman plays a piano or whatever it is, often it is a very private role. It is seen as an unpaid care role. It's seen as a duty. And often when it comes to care, when women provide care, okay, it's not seen as having an associated economic value to it. So from the outset, when we distinguish men and women in a very binary way like this, then the roles accorded to men and women, the expectations we have become very different. If you during the last session, we talked about how even in ancient Greece, right, Aristotle viewed women as castrated or mutilated, men, so again, going back to ableism, what kind of bodies do we think are of a lesser value? What kind of bodies do we think are more disposable than others? So gender kind of does, through patriarchy and sexism, fit into that larger narrative of ableism as well. So in terms of, again, socially constructed approach, gender norms, right, have changed drastically over time. I mean, the best thing to do is to just look at nowadays, they have quite a bit of this, right, of how clothing has changed over time. What is considered to be masculine clothing or feminine clothing, fashion is one of the most transient things, I think, that are around in terms of cultural um, objects, and you can see how those ideas have changed. A lot of us are from prior colonies, and we have, I mean, in Sri Lanka we were colonized by the Portuguese, Dutch, and the British. So these Victorian British ideals of morality and kind of the puritanical ideals of sex being a mode of reproduction, about sexual pleasure being sinful. These ideas still linger in our communities. Sexuality is then thought of just as a function of our body parts, right? Which is very limiting, and it also means that when we come across, this um sexuality that defies almost this Barbie Ken ideal of heteronormative sexuality, we see it as something weird, or like, ooh, gross, so for example, there's this whole thing that I've given a man with cerebral palsy with a slurred voice and using a wheelchair, trying to arrange a date with normative beauty, with long shiny hair, fair skin, you know how that goes, fair skin, white, is seen as disgusting, pervy, or unacceptable, because it doesn't fit into our heteronormative ideal of, okay, this is who a man is, and this is who a woman is, and that is what is acceptable in terms of desire and sexual relationships, right? And as I just mentioned earlier, with the colonial hangover in South Asia, a lot of us have in our criminal codes, which really are very informed by Victorian Puritanism. Section 377. In Sri Lanka, it's Section 365, but this is a criminal code that prohibits sex against the so-called order of nature. And remember last time we talked about how people perceive normal as natural as well. So these unnatural so-called acts are also seen then as abnormal, right? But then what people don't realize is all non-reproductive, so all non-vaginal reproductive sex would become sex against order of nature. However, it is often interpreted in a way in our region to subjugate, especially LGBTIQ people, right? So we still kind of hold on to this as if it is something that is true about our own cultures. But if you really um, critique it, if you really look at it in a deeper way, we are really just almost prisoner to our colonial past by really perpetuating those biases, and that those biases are still inscribed in our legal and social systems, right? Uh, the way we express gender and culture, I'm sorry, the way we express gender and sexuality, as I mentioned earlier, changes across cultures. So again, if you're looking at this kind of colonial approach to gender, uh, for example, in Sri Lanka and a lot of other countries, not just in South Asia, but also in East Asia, uh, in the past, men used to have long hair, right? And wear ornate clothing, wore jewelry, and this was seen as something really effeminate, really abnormal, and unacceptable by the colonizers. And including in countries like Sri Lanka, men were then compelled to cut their hair, wear trousers, wear a suit if they were to be taken seriously, if they were to be given any privilege. Okay, so especially people of a higher class in our country, higher caste in certain other situations, tried more and more to emulate the masculinity of the colonizers, to look that way, to pass. But, you could never pass as white, but, people tried. And that trying, who could at least attempt to pass and who couldn't really determine the social hierarchies during the colonial era. And sadly, it continues to shape the way we look at who is more valuable or more beautiful or more masculine today. One of you in the discussion group wrote about how skin whitening is still a big deal in a lot of African countries. It's the same in a lot of South Asian countries, you know. We have these fair and lovely products. So those ideals, there's a scholar called Rosemary Garland Thompson. She talks about this concept of the normate. So the normate is basically ideals of what we think are beautiful and valuable, and we still have our concepts of that, even in a, you know, especially I think not just even especially in a globalized era, are still defined by whiteness, you know, thinness, and so many other kind of variables which have a political basis to it. Sexuality, like we discussed in the first session, right? How abnormality was medicalized, that's something to be fixed. Again, so-called unnatural abnormal sexualities were deemed perversions, right? And also, just like disability became medicalized over time, so-called abnormal sexuality became medicalized over time, right? To be cured through conversion therapy, to be cured through, you know, psychological intervention. So this is very interesting because if we look at the intersections between disability and sexuality, the medicalization of sexuality actually led to the disablement in that sense, right, of LGBTIQ people, because it became equated with psychosocial disability, you know, and it still is the case in a lot of countries, and things like conversion therapy continues to unfortunately happen in a lot of societies, right? But this medicalization is a crossover point for the two movements to potentially rally on, right? We also had gendered pathologization, not just the so-called abnormal sexualities. So the whole concept of a hysterical woman, you know, the mad woman, PMS, right? Okay, so you're having a bad day and people go, oh, she must be PMSing, you know, and then you laugh about it like it's nothing. But, you know, in the long run, that kind of conceptualization, even of the woman, the woman's body, you know, are menstruating, you know, uh, beautiful bodies, is quite oppressive. One of you had written in the discussion sections, you know, you have small things like calling a woman who is, you know, angry a mad woman or an insane woman, or saying she's PMSing. That seems like something small, but these small things are what adds up to very oppressive norms. You know, this is called microviolence. Small day-to-day experiences of what we wouldn't even necessarily consider violent, but they have very harmful impacts in the long run, right? So just like disability and the governance of bodies through biopower, institutionalization, we still have that with the governance of sexuality, right? Technically, in a lot of countries, given the legal codes, you can imprison LGBTIQ people. In certain countries, you still get the death sentence being passed. You still get LGBTIQ people being incarcerated, being subjected to the death sentence, right? So very oppressive normative frameworks. We talked about the tyranny of the norm in our last session. It really weighs heavily when we look at the governance of sexuality, in many societies, even today. Then we have unspoken standards, right? Especially again, for me, I guess, from coming from the global south, colonization has really tainted our cultural ideas, but this could be the case in any society. So I'm not saying all this happened because we are colonized, but I'm just saying that our historical trajectories are such that it happens to be so, right? So especially during the emancipation movements, the independence movements, this whole concept of the mother nation became very big, especially in South Asian countries, and some of you from the region may be able to identify with this. So the mother nation ideal was based on the respectability of women, you know, as mothers, as procreators, as those who would give birth to the nation, or the body politic of those who would nurture and raise embrace, this whatever independent nation that could be the Sri Lankan nation, or a lot of our states that were created very recently through the decolonization process, right? That also then led to this whole concept of honor and dignity, and the honor of women, and these concepts of the mother nation and the honor of the nation and the honor of the family have in the long run become very oppressive, in terms of gender norms for many women. And also in terms of governing sexuality, we'll look at this deeper, especially for persons with disabilities, by denying their right to be in relationships, to reproduce, to have families, by sterilization, extermination, you again control this so-called abnormal or unnatural sexuality, right? But I think in reality, if we are critical, if we don't necessarily just go with the flow of our cultural narratives, there are so many instances where this binary is disrupted. During the last session, I think Prashant, you spoke about the reality of intersex people, right? So intersex people, babies who may have reproductive characteristics deemed both male and female, or who have ambiguous sex organs, right? So for me, the birth of an intersex child in itself is like a big kind of wake up call to say, no, even at a very biologically deterministic level, right? If you want to look at it that way, this binary doesn't work. Unfortunately, because we are so hung up on the binary, a lot of children who are born intersex immediately, before they even leave the hospital, are subject to corrective surgeries, where they are then kind of made to have sex organs that are either male or female. And that really is very unfair in that sense, because it doesn't leave room for an intersex identity for those children to decide for themselves as to how they want to live. So like I mentioned last time, some of these slides have the recommended video prompt. There's a really cool short documentary on what it's like to be intersex. What's it like to be intersex? All these videos are in the additional resources section of the learning platform. So as you go along, if you could check out those videos as well, it will really give you a better perspective of what I am talking about, right? Similarly, this whole concept of gender. So that was in terms of sex and the sexed body. In terms of gender, the existence of transgender, transsexual, gender non-conforming people. I mean, it's really so wonderfully disruptive, right? And I think it is really to embrace that disruptive capacity through our activism, even within the field of disability. To look at the not just the struggles, the realities of people who are intersex, people who are trans, would be a really good, another good point of collaboration between the disability and LGBTIQ movements, in my opinion. We talked about biopower last time, right? So the influence of institutions, of practices, of dominant processes and social hierarchies, and how they operate to create and to maintain, and especially to maintain the binaries, right? So that we would not get confused. You guys may have heard of Caster Semenya. She is a fantastic athlete from South Africa who has been participating in women's athletics. And she, sorry guys, I'm just, sorry people, here we go. Caster Semenya, and she, people said, hey, look, she looks like a man, she looks very masculine, something's wrong. And then of course that led to her medicalization because of this perception that she doesn't look like a woman, right? So then that medicalization happened, and she was diagnosed with difference of sexual development, and that was kind of pathologized. And then it was said that, okay, she needs to be cured, treated, and to be like a woman, she needs to take medication that reduces her testosterone levels, right? So she kind of questioned this, and she took it to the IAAF. She submitted a case, but the IAAF rule saying if you want to participate in women's sports, you need to be quote unquote a woman. And if we have a very biologically deterministic way of understanding women, that meant that Caster Semenya had to take medication to reduce her testosterone levels. And at the end of the day, that is what the ruling was. So you can see how people who do not fit into that binary model, create a lot of almost fear, right? Because it disrupts assumed reality, assumed truth of binary gender and binary sexual desire. Okay. Sexuality at the end of the day is a very important part of who we are, our sense of belonging, our sense of worth, our sense of desirability, our sense of expression, intimacy, connectivity to others. All these things are tied, to our sexuality. So sexuality is often seen as something not important, as a private issue, especially in the disability movement, including in my own country. But that really, and we looked at how the domination of movements by especially males with physical disabilities have created very specific quote unquote public agendas, right? But the denial of sexuality is actually uh, very harmful in the bigger picture. There are a couple of quotes which I thought were fantastic, and this relates to the reading by Shakespeare. Hopefully, all of you have had a chance to read through it. It's a very good introduction to issues in terms of disability sexuality, right? So Anne Finger says, sexuality is often the source of our deepest oppression. It is also often the source of our deepest pain. It is either for us to talk about and formulate strategies for changing discrimination in employment. It is easy. I'm going to say that again. Clearly, my pain is kind of disrupting how I'm reading, but that's okay. Sexuality is often the source of our deepest oppression. It is also often the source of our deepest pain. It is easier for us to talk about and formulate strategies for changing discrimination in employment, education, and housing than to talk about our exclusion from sexuality and reproduction. And I think that is so very true. With a lot of us, historically being institutionalized, being subjected to very restrictive guardianship arrangements, expressing our sexuality, claiming our reproductive rights has been a very difficult process. And even with the devaluation of disabled persons, including women, the kind of violence that we have historically faced, to sterilization, to gender-based violence, sexual harm, euthanization, we carry a lot of trauma, I think, um, as a global population when it comes to disability and sexuality. Stephen Seedman says sexuality is perhaps the last human dimension that many of us refuse to grant, is socially created, historically variable, and therefore deeply political. And this is where the whole, understanding how normative forces affect the way we look at gender and sexuality, including disability sexuality, becomes really important. And finally, Wilkerson, I love this quote. A group's experience of sexually based harms and constraints on sexual agency is the hallmark of oppression. We look at the sexual oppression of many minority groups, maybe it's Black ethnic minority people, indigenous populations, and so on, facing sexual harms, and often sexual harm or the denial of sexuality are very closely associated with oppression. So we're going to now have a short time to discuss this question. And I know a few of you have already posted your views on the discussion group, which is, what are the stereotypes of sexuality regarding persons with disabilities in your community? So just, I'm going to go back to Stop share. Okay, we are back. So I'm just looking at some of the questions you have. Okay, intersection. So intersex persons are people who are either born with both male and female sex characteristics or sex organs, or ambiguous. That means that are not clear, so that you can't really say, okay, this is a male body or a female body. But intersex people in the long run have really reshaped the way we look at disability as well, in terms of challenging that binary. Yeah, Almas, thank you so much for intervening. Transgender person means a person born with one set of biological characteristics but identifies with the other or others, right? So thank you for the clarifications. So the question was, what are some of the stereotypes regarding the sexuality of persons with disabilities that you have in your community? Okay, so if you would like to, yes, you can start typing it on the comment box. Noorzada says, persons with disabilities are seen as asexual, not attractive, or not feeling attraction to. Exactly. If you read, or if you have already gone through the radical action components featuring Fatima and Senarat, you will see how this really does pan out in real life and in the sexual experiences of persons with disabilities. Liana says PWDs are seen as asexual or hypersexual. Yeah, exactly. And especially when it comes to persons with intellectual or psychosocial disabilities, this whole concept of how hypersexuality comes out quite a bit. In terms of psychosocial disabilities, people are also considered dangerous, and potential sexual predators, and you get all kinds of other myths floating around. In terms of asexuality, yes, persons with disabilities are seen as um, perennial children or people who do not have any sexual desire. Alma, your hand is raised. Did you have something to mention?
Um, yeah, thank you for calling on me. And I just wanted to mention that in terms of when we're talking about persons with disability and their sexuality, although the community as a whole does not want to acknowledge that there's a sexual nature to their being, coming from India and the legislation that we see with regard to the rights of persons with disability per se, but they also there's a specific provision which states that, which looks into sexual violence against women and girl child who are disabled. That means on some level the community agrees that there is some sort of sexuality that is associated with it, even when it comes with terms of violence. So there is some sort of sexuality, but the only time that they acknowledge it is when we are talking about violence and sexual assault and what is the sort of remedy provided to it. But when it comes to actual sexuality in our regular lives, that is not being addressed. I just wanted to point that out.
Thank you so much, Alma. That was such an excellent point. Because it then comes back to the view that persons with disabilities are vulnerable, right? That we do not have necessarily a sense of agency, that we are fragile, right? So in terms of that view of vulnerability, then you would start worrying about, sexual assault. But then it's not just a worry, it is a reality, right? For a lot of people, but the view of disability as vulnerability makes it easier for us to talk about sexuality in terms of violence and abuse. But if you look at sexuality as devalued, as undesirable, then it doesn't make sense for us to talk about disability in terms of desire, in terms of attraction, in terms of intimacy, right? So that's a really fantastic point. Thanks so much for sharing with us. Larissa says PWTD should not reproduce. Exactly, right? We talked about eugenic cultures last time, where people are even sterilized because of that view. Valentina, women with disabilities should not be mothers. That is so true. And later we'll talk about this whole concept of rolelessness, right? We talked about social norms as being oppressive, but there are also the norms that says women should be mothers, okay? The expectation, and for us, those of us who are not mothers, this thing, oh gosh, you're really not fulfilling the role of the woman. But then when we come to women with disabilities, like what Valentina says, they are denied even those normative roles. So whether that's liberating or not is up to question. But yes, that's a great point. We have Vishan who says, yes, in Sudan, they're seen as asexual. Um, I'm just slowly scrolling through. Um, okay, so the equality, okay. Joanna says persons with psychosocial disabilities are assumed to not have legal capacity to make sexual choices. Fantastic point, Joanna. This also goes for women with intellectual or cognitive disabilities, right? This concept that you don't know what's good for you, right? Or you are also assumptions of promiscuity and things like that. So that's a great point. Women and girls being infantilized often leading to their overprotection, right? That's a great point. Larissa, it is normal that men with disabilities show sexual aggressive conducts, right? Yeah, so again, especially when it comes to psychosocial intellectual disabilities, the idea that we are dangerous, right? Theophilus, in my community, they're seen as asexual, incapable of making decisions that affect their sexuality. Um, I know I am not going through all the responses, and I'm so happy to see all your responses here. Seriously, you guys need to start like bringing this awesomeness out in the learning platform as well, right? Because then we actually do have space to really hash out and share, because the time we have in these live sessions are somewhat limited. Um, so Marina says, sorry, yeah, Marina says, so unable to have reproductive sex, unable to give consent, similar ideas, right? This is very interesting. Notice says PWDs are looked as with not good looking in public spaces. We talked about last time the ugly laws. Remember that how so-called ugly disabled people should not be in public spaces. So although our countries don't have such extreme laws, at least not to my knowledge, the sentiment remains, right? I mean, talk about being desirable. You shouldn't even be out there looking ugly kind of mentality. Okay. Women who became disabled due to war. So Kamaleshwari, thank you so much. So from the context of conflict, right? Women who became disabled due to war are not allowed to marry or remarry. Exactly. That stigma that goes with having acquired a disability. And a lot of our countries, we have experienced war and conflict. And here I want to quickly mention that it's quite different for veterans with disabilities. Like in Sri Lanka, the ex-soldiers with disabilities, there are public campaigns to arrange for their marriages. They're seen as heroic and victorious, and that women who marry persons like ex-soldiers or veterans with disabilities are seen as very honorable. So as you can see, that double standard remains even within disability. Nelly says queer folks with disabilities often explore pleasure and desirability beyond what is seen as desirable, beautiful, ugly, acceptable. And the question is, gosh, your answer just, yeah. Sorry guys, because when there are lots of people typing answers, sometimes the text goes up and then I can't read the rest of your answers. So please do bear with me. But that is so true, like in terms of disability sexuality. It's quite subversive, I would say. And we'll actually talk about that later when it comes to disability justice. So again, thank you so much for your fantastic contributions. Please move this again to the Learning platform, because we don't have a lot of time during these live sessions to explore all of your responses. So thanks so much again for sharing with us. Okay, going back. Yeah, so I'm not going to go through these because I think we covered most of it. just in terms of disabled men, who are often feminized. That's something that we didn't really talk about, right? But that kind of feminization, often leads to the need for men with disabilities to be hyper, I don't know, kind of like hyper macho or like super macho. There's a nice short video on Murderball. Murderball is a movie about the US wheelchair rugby team, and it's very interesting how they are very macho and hyper masculine in their approach, and in their kind of expression of their gender and sexuality. So these are things that you could look at, right? So now we're going to move to a very interesting area. All these different axes, right, of identity, of embodied experience. We've looked at disability, we looked at gender, we looked at sexuality. How do these come together to create privilege and discrimination, right? So I'm talking about privilege and discrimination here as two sides of the same coin. We have I'm sure a lot of you have heard of compulsory heterosexuality, or some of you, but compulsory able-bodiedness is a less known concept, okay? The thing here is, some of you raised this in the discussion forum. In order to play these male and female roles, you assume that the male and the female have certain types of bodies, right? So guys being like tall or strong, or fertile, or kind of very what would I say, fit, the concept of fitness, and women being docile, women being caring, reproducing, nurturing. We have all these different ideas. So these ideas are actually premised on the concept that bodies are able bodies, or bodies are bodies that can perform and function in a certain heteronormative way, right? So that is what we mean by compulsory able-bodiedness, okay? And often we give privilege, worth, and social currency for those able bodies that can fit into these ideal, right? So the fitness to parent, capacity to consent, the idea of sexual prowess, right? All these are actually premised upon a subject who is a gendered subject, right? So heteropatriarchy makes a normative subject a gendered subject. So it's either a male or a female, okay? And that body is an able body. So that's why even last time I said that ableism really undercuts many manifestations and forms of oppression, which then leads to those roles, those socially valued normative roles, not being available to, for example, women with disabilities. One of you shared just now in the chat box how women with disabilities are not seen as ideal or suitable mothers, right? In terms of privilege, so the fifth point there, right? A lot of our social cultural systems and environments are there to cater to the needs of the normative citizen, right? So for example, employers often prefer these unencumbered workers. Unencumbered worker means someone without duties of care or any obligation outside the workplace. So the assumption is, especially male workers, okay, they're not going to get pregnant, they don't have to take care of kids, so they are ideally unencumbered workers. I have, even in my personal circles, encountered people who say, I don't want to hire women because they are just going to take, maternity leave, and then they'll have to just go home early to take care of their kids. So it doesn't make sense to hire women. See, so this is the whole thing. So the privilege in terms of those who are assumed as not having care roles, of being able to perform in a certain way, which often happens to be, able-bodied men. There are, so when we talk about privilege, we'll come to intersectionality in a bit, so I wouldn't necessarily go through it in detail at this moment, right? But this also then leads to different hierarchies. The privileges that people have, whether it's your white privilege, whether it's like patriarchal privilege, is not usually something that's earned. It's kind of something that is attributed to you by virtue of who you are, or who you are perceived to be. So privilege and oppression are really like two sides of the same coin of a system of inequality, whether it be sexism or racism or ableism, right? Also in terms of privilege of who can claim to be disabled or a person with disabilities, right? Often, remember, like we talked about how in a lot of our countries, and even in the discussion forum, a couple of you mentioned that we still have a very charity-based idea of what disability is, right? And the trope of the disabled beggar or the disabled homeless person, right? So sometimes in such societies, claiming a disability identity also means you kind of have to be okay with being perceived in those very oppressive ways as well. Okay, so that can be problematic. The other thing, especially when it comes to invisible disabilities like psychosocial disabilities, right? Psychosocial and other invisible disabilities, in a sense, also people need to just with LGBTIQ populations come out, right? Like it's something invisible where you have to, in a sense, declare. Okay, it's not something evident, but then declaring your, embodied experience as a person with psychosocial disabilities can, maybe end up in you being marginalized or, dismissed from employment. So maybe such a person will find it difficult to claim that identity of disability as well, right? Then we spoke, when we looked at the neo-colonial model of disability bodies, there's a picture here, and the picture is of a scavenger, right? It's a man who is in a sewage pit, right? He's neck deep in sewage. This is gunk, this is garbage, and he's either trying to fix this or to find something. But when people are so devalued, when the bodies of some people, working class people, people from the global south, sweatshop workers are so devalued, right? And over time, because of exposure to such unsafe conditions, when your body wears away, when you get sick, and when you die young, but still you don't have the privilege to claim disability. This is what we call debility, right? So you need to keep earning. You need to kind of function within the system that you're in, and even such people often cannot claim disability, right? So it's the whole concept of privilege can be very complex. It's not just about, oh, this is about able-bodied people and disabled people. It's much more complex than that, right? So one of you just now in the chat box said women with disabilities especially are often seen as victims of abuse, but not as kind of sexual subjects. And that was such a great point, because this brings us back to vulnerability and privilege, right? So often those, especially when it comes to persons with disabilities, we are seen as vulnerable, right? And then you kind of rank order people, this whole idea of possessive individualism, right? About us having a sense of agency and independence, and disabled people not necessarily having that. That really shapes the way in which we are treated. So sometimes we are not treated as fully human, sometimes not as fully adult, right? But then also, on the other hand, and I know Mildred has emailed all of you about the variable component. Um, in situations like COVID-19, if you look at vulnerability, people in nursing homes, people in institutions, so that's includes persons with disabilities, people who have pre-existing health conditions, right? They are the ones who are on the bottom of the list of who should receive care in many countries, right? I'm not going to go too much into this topic because I know you'll have a fantastic discussion on the variable component discussion thread on this. But that was a real eye-opener for me in terms of the vulnerability of persons with disabilities, the attributed vulnerability and the experience vulnerability, right? So the devaluation also what it does is it normalizes abuse, right? You in Sri Lanka we have the plight of domestic workers, right? So women who go to the Middle East and often experience very harsh conditions, but the oppression of such women, it's normalized. It's kind of like, hey, so they are domestic workers, they need to put up with it, kind of idea is there. So this also happens when we talk about persons with disabilities, institutionalized violence and things like that. It's often seen as okay, right? Which really alerts us to look at this whole like ableism that runs across many ways in which we evaluate the worth and dignity of people, right? Um, so that brings us to normative identities, right? Again, heterosexuality or compulsory heteronormativity is very strongly tied to our concepts of able-bodiedness, ability, fitness, functionality, right? And then you have, if you look at able-bodiedness and heterosexuality, ideals of an able-bodied person and our ideals of a gendered heteronormative person actually has a lot of overlap, right? Non-normative positionalities, we talked about othering last time, right? So in terms of that, the non-normative, be it persons with disabilities, be it LGBTIQ people, are not just perceived and defined, but also understood as in opposition, right, to normative people. So able-bodied people are seen as, let's say, tall, strong, straight. People with disabilities are automatically assumed to be weak or excitable or perverse or, lazy. So even characteristically, they are quite different. There's this concept called being characterologically suspect, like being suspicious, being deviant by virtue of just who you are or how you look like. And especially when it comes to disability, including psychosocial disability, a lot of us, end up being characterologically suspect. And that's why there's a large number of persons with disabilities in prisons and other incarceration facilities. We'll look at that in detail. Inequality and discrimination, we've talked about this quite a lot already. Discrimination and inequality happens at many levels. I'm not going to just go into it kind of point by point here. You can read it when you go through the PowerPoint. But these two experiences of inequality and discrimination are realities in the lives of many of us with disabilities, right? It has shaped kind of how we experience life, and also for a lot of us, how we view ourselves through internalized ableism, internalized phobia, and basically just internalizing that oppression that we face almost on a daily basis, right? So in terms of barriers to accessing sexuality, right? When we look at LGBTIQ spaces and persons with disabilities, I mean, so I identify as a queer person, right? And in the LGBTIQ communities, one thing that has often been raised by members who are also persons with disabilities is that our spaces are often inaccessible, right? That we haven't created alliances around understandings of how both disability and sexuality are medicalized, how we haven't really created alliances around how disability sexuality and also LGBTIQ or queer sexuality can both be disruptive, right? We talked about stereotypes, a lack of agency and lack of privacy. A lot of these persons with disabilities live in institutions, in guardianship settings. So even expressing one's sexuality becomes very hard, right? Then assumptions of deprivation, now violence, like one of you pointed out, right? If you're seen as, vulnerable as opposed to someone with sexual agency, then, you're going to be so-called protected from sexuality. Assumptions of unfitness, okay? The division of carer and cared for, right? So there's no kind of provision there to look at how persons with disabilities can have assisted sex, right? And we'll look at that later as well. There's a fantastic video, a short video in the additional resources section on assisted sexuality. It's a service that they're providing in Taiwan. Some people find that topic to be very taboo or controversial, but it's something interesting to look at because it's really asking us to step out beyond this heteropatriarchal, totally in control of my body, reproductive kind of notion of sexuality. So that's why I said a lack of imagination in itself is a barrier to accessing sexuality, right? Then we're going to go into the final element of what this course is about, which is disability, sexuality, and rights, right? Human rights approach to disability really radically changes the way we think about disability, right? What do rights have to do with, sexuality? What are rights? If all of us, by virtue of being born human in this world, regardless of context, have these inalienable, unchallenged rights, what does that mean for persons with disabilities, especially in situations where persons with disabilities are seen as lesser than human? So a couple of you on the discussion forum have pointed out something really interesting. It was that your countries have signed or endorsed the CRPD, which is the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the ultimate human rights framework when it comes to disabilities. But you pointed out, but still in your countries, and I would say even in my country, Sri Lanka, in your countries, persons with disabilities are seen through a charity angle, right? And that disability still falls under the Ministry of Social Welfare, okay? And I think part of this is also that inability to see persons with disabilities as fully human, as agents with human rights. So it's very interesting to see, well, how can we then bridge that gap in the long run? Right? We claim our rights. The United Nations framework is like kind of the mothership when it comes to rights frameworks internationally. And the Convention on the Rights of Disabilities that I just mentioned is the result of the tireless efforts of many persons with disabilities from across the globe. DPOs, disabled people's organizations, played a big role in negotiating that convention. So in that sense, it's really a source of pride in the larger disability community, right? But the problem is that when we look at rights, it's a very individualized way of looking at what our entitlements and responsibilities are, right? Rights can be claimed by allied groups with discrimination that cuts across identities, right? Sexual rights are an example of this kind. So we can't look at sexuality, separately, livelihood separately, disability rights separately, or indigenous rights separately, or black rights separately, because all these at the end of the day are very interconnected and cut across each other. So that is where, then the thinking around rights needs to be a bit more nuanced, right? Where disability justice comes into the picture. I have a small a slide with two images. There are descriptions of images in the notes section. I'm not going to go through both images, but I'm going to go through the first one, right? So in the first image, there are three people, okay? One looks like a tall person. The second one is like a shorter person. And the third person is a wheelchair user. So in the first picture, you have the tall person who has a box and they are looking over a fence, and I think they're watching a football match. Okay, so on a box, the tall person has a very clear view. Then the next shorter person also has a box, and that person doesn't have a very clear view of what's going on. Then there is also the wheelchair user who has a box, but of what use is a box to the wheelchair user? Their view is completely obstructed. Okay, so this kind of is saying, yes, if we look at human rights as equality in the sense of treating people equally or treating people the same, that doesn't necessarily work, right? In the second image, we have the tall person without a box, because they don't need a box. They can still see the game, right, without obstruction. Then the shorter person has two boxes, right? Now that person can also see the game without obstruction. And the final person, the wheelchair user, doesn't have a box, but has a ramp. And the person can come up the ramp and now see over the hedge and can see the game and participate equally. So what it's showing is, if we have existing underlying inequities, right, and the results of long-term oppression, equality as sameness is not going to work. which is why we need equitable solutions, right? And that's something really to keep in mind, especially when we think of disability, right? Um, Disability rights are not exactly these special or extra rights. It's looking at how existing rights framework apply to persons with disabilities, right? Next week, you will talk more about the concept of intersectionality. So again, as I mentioned before, oppression is not something static or self-evident, right? So for example, in my case, yes, I'm a woman with disabilities, but let's say I also belong to a majority ethnic group in my country. I am, let's say, from an upper middle class family. So you have these multiple aspects of your identity kind of interacting and coming together to create certain disadvantages and certain privileges, right? So rather than just talking about disabled people are oppressed, okay, it makes more sense to look at how those intersectional factors come into play in the life experiences of people, right? Um, in
Nilufa,
terms, yeah,
Nilufa, will you make it full screen, please? We're getting a
oh, so
request.
sorry. Thank you. Sorry, guys. I'm so used to just having it that way. This is much better. Sorry about that, right? So disability according to CRPD, disability is seen. So CRPD again is a Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Disability is an evolving concept, and that disability results from the interaction between persons with impairments and attitudinal and environmental barriers that hinders their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others, right? So this is very interesting. As you can see, this definition is very heavily informed by the social model of disability, right? Recognizing that disability arises from attitudinal and environmental barriers, right? And here the outcome is participation on an equal basis with others. But as I mentioned, that doesn't necessarily mean that you treat people the same, okay? For the outcome of equality, you often need equitable actions that take into the long-standing oppression into consideration, right? Persons with disabilities, according to Article 1, are those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society. So again, looking at a very social model approach to disability, but also acknowledging the existence of, you know, impairment and how that is what then mediates that experience in relation to your social participation, right? Um, the CRPD is really the first UN convention that has general principles. I'm not going to go into this in great detail today, but please do go through the PowerPoints. And as I mentioned earlier, some PowerPoints have recommended readings, which you can find in your reading list or in the additional resources section. I will leave you to do that. A couple of important articles in the CRPD one is Article 12, which looks at the equal legal capacity of all. So remember, we are assuming that disabled people are asexual or vulnerable or incapable of making decisions. This article directly challenges it. And one thing that is very significant here is traditionally in human rights, we look at independent decision making, right? The concept of this atomistic individualism. Uh, but with Article 12, what they're saying is the right to support to exercise legal capacity. So for the first time in a human rights instrument, supported decision making is also identified here, right? Which I think is quite significant. Article 19 is on living independently and being included in the community, right? And this really, remember we talked about the institutionalization and also some very oppressive guardianship arrangements leading to the lack of participation of people with disabilities generally. I mean, not just in terms of sexuality, but in terms of public participation. Article 19 also becomes quite important, right? And some of the other articles that are relevant are Articles 25, 14, 16 and 23. 23 is the article that deals explicitly with respect for home and family. What's interesting here, sorry, is that again, it's a very heteronormative idea of sexuality, and it's in the context of marriage and reproduction and parenthood, right? When this convention was being negotiated, there was a lot of opposition from certain more conservative countries that if you talked about sexuality outside these heteronormative arrangements, that might lead people to think that, queer sexuality is okay, that, sexuality between unmarried people are okay, and there were lots of debates around that, which you can read up on if you really are interested. But so we do still have an article that leads with home and family life, but it's still in a very kind of heteronormative framework that we uh, deal with it in the CRPD, right? So, like one of you mentioned in the discussion thread, in a lot of our countries, we have a very social welfare approach to disability, but what the CRPD potentially does, is that it moves us to a rights-based understanding of disability based on independent living and community participation. You can read about that later. There's also some links that I have provided to some good websites, which I would encourage you to check out, right? So finally, let's kind of bring this all together, right? Disability, sexuality, rights, what this institute is about, okay? Um, so, I'm just gonna quickly skip through because I think you can uh, read this on your own, because I want to quickly look at this concept of disability justice, right? We have different, what can I say, bases or axes of oppression. So it could be racism, ableism, sexism, heteropatriarchy, all. There are so many different axes. But human rights, while it assumes that everyone has individualized rights, there is no direct challenge of the systems of oppression in place, right? But with disability justice, that is a radically different approach. There's an organization called Sins Invalid. In your additional resources section, there'll be an amazing clip there, Sins Invalid. That is the trailer for their film. See, they really transform the way I look at disability, sexuality, especially in a very radical way when I went for one of their performances. They're a disability, sexuality-based performing arts company, but they have done a lot to develop this concept, okay, of disability. Remember how in our first session we looked at ableism as viewing disability as something inherently undesirable, harmful, or wrong? Well, disability justice is about challenging that, right? Where you celebrate the beauty of and desire for disabled minds and bodies, okay? Where you shift from this whole concept of fitness and capacity to be a mother or a father or whatever to human well-beings, right? Where also we then question, remember, sameness doesn't lead to equality, but sadly, often when we talk about human rights, it's understood as treating everyone equally, right? Disability justice questions that. It embraces corporeal difference and diversity, right? So again, a bit similar to the Nordic or the relational model, where you don't look at disability as something abnormal, but it's seen as something that is, an aspect of human diversity. It questions the myth of independence, right? And it says, sorry guys, sorry, I'm just going to go back. Here we go. We are all interdependent. We all rely on care, so the whole, I guess, thinking around care and independence, that is challenged to the disability justice framework, okay? This whole thing, we've talked about this quite a bit. What bodies are valuable, what bodies are desirable, what bodies are disposable, really looking at that aspect of ableism is something that disability justice has kind of offered to us, right? So rather than looking at our worth in terms of productive or reproductive capacity, how can we look at it through a lens of diversity and dignity, right? So the Mia Mingus blog post would be quite helpful in this respect. There are 10 principles of disability justice. I won't go through this in detail because in module 2, you're going to really do a deep dive into disability justice, right? But this is what's interesting. There's an image here of a poster. Again, this is from Scenes Invalid, right? It says over 50% of people killed by police are disabled. Remember, I said a lot of us end up in prisons, in incarceration facilities, right? There is another poster also on disability justice, again from Scenes Invalid. It has a picture of a woman in prison clothes who is a wheelchair user, holding hands with a woman in a hijab, and she has an amputated arm and an amputated leg. And behind her, there's a bomb explosion, there's a plane dropping bombs. Okay, the thing with the disability of justice approach is it helps us to create cross connections, right? It helps us to see the relationship between the prison industrial concept, the prison industrial one complex. Okay, the prison industrial complex, sorry, and the military industrial complex. It helps us to identify, common sources of oppression. So taking that further, so taking disability justice into peer disability sexualities, is that if we look at our bodies and our minds, our crip minds, disabled minds, our crip bodies, disabled bodies, right? The way we express sexuality, the way we kind of even perform sex could be radically different to those heteronormative ideals that I talk about, right? And so does that make that by virtue of just being a disabled sexual person, is that in itself very disruptive to our understanding of what sexuality is and how sexuality is, performed? And I'm sure you'll go through that in detail in the next module. I speak here about subversive desires, but I will leave that to you to explore in person, right? Why again are we looking at disability sexuality? Because of the kind of myths, stereotypes that deny sexual expression, that deny our desirability, that deny our access to sexual reproductive health rights. Okay, so these normative principles that deny us of our parenthood, that results in our children being taken away because of the assumption that we are unfit parents, right? The discrimination and stigma and the microviolence, sorry, that we face on a daily basis. All these aspects and more leads to a need to really talk about disability sexuality. Okay, I'm conscious of the time here. I know we have about 10 minutes more. I will let you go through this on your own. Just to remember that a lot of different forms of oppression, like disability, sexuality, gender, and race, are very interrelated. And undercutting all that is ableism. Ableism being the devaluation and dehumanization of some bodies and minds over others. The view that some bodies and minds are wrong or defective or need to be controlled or fixed or cured or eliminated, right? Just keep that in mind as you navigate all these different forms of oppression, because those positionalities come together, including our relative privileges and disadvantages and life experiences to create a kind of embodied identity, right? Thank you so much for coming for the second session as well. It's been fantastic kind of sharing all of this with you. I'm excited for your sessions next week, where you will look at the whole concept of crip justice and disability justice and the subversive potential of disability sexuality. And have a lovely evening or a day based on where you are.